Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth COVID-19 Conversation Series, featuring stories where barriers to advancing equity and justice were removed during the pandemic and views of a more equitable and just future emerged. Through this series, our intent is to create space where people can really listen deeply, connect, dream, and reflect on stories that continue to open up the range of what is possible to advance equity and justice. My name is Nandini Saxena. I'm a knowledge translation specialist with the National Collaborating Centre for Determinants of Health, and I'm going to be your host for today's first storytelling session in this series. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. So our conversation today is going to be recorded. It'll be sent by email to all registrants, and it will also be available on the NCCDH website. And what you'll find as well on the bottom of your screen is a chat box. So I encourage you to use that freely, share comments, questions for our speakers today, and also for other participants. And Pema, who's just posted a first comment in the chat, is going to be our chat box moderator for today's conversation. And I'd also like to just thank you to Diane, Pema, and Hannah, who are our amazing tech team behind the scenes, and who are going to help me do an amazing job with today's session. So before we get started, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. And so what you'll see on the slide, once it's moved to that slide, is really the key elements of the National Collaborating Centre for Determinants of Health land acknowledgement. And I think the things that I'd like to share about this particular land acknowledgement is that the 1725 treaties of peace and friendship between the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik peoples and the British Crown do not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, and instead recognize Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and created rules for what was supposed to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And for myself, I'm an immigrant settler joining from Treaty 13 territory, which is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Treaty 13 was established in 1805 at a time when Black people, forcibly brought to Turtle Island through the transatlantic slave trade, were enslaved or actively resisting enslavement. And when the enslavement of Black people was a common practice among members of the early Upper Canada legislative assemblies, now in Ontario. And connected to the focus of our conversation today, which is all about prioritizing reconciliation, is that while sharing land acknowledgements are an important way to acknowledge and offer gratitude for the lands that we all live, work, and play on, they can also be performative if not accompanied by concrete actions that advance reconciliation. And Pema is going to share an interesting resource in the chat about territorial acknowledgements from the First Nations Health Authority. So moving on to the next slide, a bit of background about our organization. So the National Collaborating Centre for Determinants of Health, or NCCDH, is one of 6 national collaborating centres funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we were all created post-SARS. Each centre, which you'll see on this map, distributed across the country, has a particular focus. And so the NCCDH is about supporting public health to take action on the structural and social determinants of health and to advance health equity. So moving on to the next slide, today's story is about prioritizing reconciliation, collectives, trust, and humanity. We have 3 amazing speakers with us today. Jesse Thunderchild is our featured storyteller who will be sharing work that he's been doing to prioritize reconciliation through his organization Street Culture Project in Regina, Saskatchewan. Jesse, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, for sure. My name is Jesse Thunderchild. I'm a director at Street Culture Project in Regina. My official job title is Director of Indigenous Experience. Basically, in a nutshell, my job is to be the eyes and ears of our agency. We are a youth serving organization, and our demographic is it fluctuates, but primarily Indigenous youth come to our programs and services and access us in some form or another. But my job is to make sure that all these youth are receiving culturally relevant and supportive care, services, programming, all of that. And it's being delivered in a fashion that is true to the TRC Commission's recommendations. So that's who I am in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jesse. And Daniel Sims, who is one of our reflective guests for today's session. Would you like to introduce yourself, Daniel?
Yes, Dan Chair. My name is Daniel Sims. I'm a band member of the Saskatchewan First Nation and a faculty member at the University of Northern British Columbia. I do a lot of work with my own community regarding language and culture, and because I'm currently located in the traditional territory of Lake Legendary, but my nation's also located in British Columbia as well, land claims. So thank you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Daniel. And we are expecting a second reflective guest, Sandy Allison, and once she joins, we'll ask Sandy to introduce herself. So before we get started, I'd invite everyone to take part in an opening poll in Slido. So on the screen in front of you, you'll see a QR code. You can either use your phone to join the poll or go to slido.com and enter that event number. And what we're asking people to do is to really input your thoughts, sharing a word or a phrase that you think of when you hear the word reconciliation. And so I'll just wait for a few seconds while people make their way over to this poll. And yeah, some of you are already extremely tech savvy. It's amazing to see. And yeah, there are some really interesting comments that are starting to emerge. And I see that about 5 of you have participated so far. And yeah, so some of it is really about values. It's about humility. It's about learning. It's about justice. It's about respect. And others of you have commented that this is about land. And this is about recognizing racism and acknowledging the need to address the human rights of different people on this land, including very much Indigenous peoples. Land back, the need for accountable relationships. I'll wait just a few more seconds as this image in front of us continues to evolve. And there are, again, some really incredible thoughts that are appearing here. The need for Indigenous sovereignty, the need for connection, the need for reparations, and the need for action based on relationships and values. So thank you so much for those of you who took part in that poll. That gives us a really beautiful snapshot of where people's minds are at. And I think many of these words and values will continue to emerge during the rest of our conversation. So on that note, I'll invite you, Jesse, to share your story about prioritizing reconciliation.
Perfect. Thank you for having me, everybody. Yeah, I was actually just having a quick look at that list of the words that people have typed in there, and I will tell you right off the bat, none of you are wrong. Everybody is right. I mean, there's no wrong answers, you know, when it comes to it, you know, because in the end, what really matters when it comes to reconciliation is that you're trying to understand. You're trying to be a part of it. And as an Indigenous person, and as a human being for that matter, you know, what can I ask of somebody? And especially when it comes to trying to make another person understand the pain and the trauma that you were brought up with, you know, regardless of whether or not, you know, for my people, whether you were physically in the residential school system, whether or not you were physically taken in the 60s scoop, you know, it's trauma, and whether we like it or not, it's passed down, it's inherited. And one of the best quotes I ever heard when it came to this was, I don't know if any of you know Chief Cadmus Delorme, formerly of Cowessess First Nation. But in his words, he said, none of us wanted this. We all inherited this, whether we like it or not. But what's really important is that we understand that we are healing and we are hurting. And let's do something about it. It's not a verbatim quote, but that's the gist of what he said. And let me tell you, growing up, I'll give you some quick background of where I'm coming from so that everybody kind of knows where I'm at in my headspace. I was brought up in two territories. I was born in Treaty 1, Winnipeg, Manitoba. My mom's from Roseau River First Nation. And this will be a little bit relevant as I'm speaking later on, but my mom is actually half Jewish. And there's a story there that I had no idea of what was going on until later in life. I'll get back to that later. But my dad is from Treaty 6, Thunderchild First Nation, which is northern middle Saskatchewan. But my dad brought me up, whether he liked it or not, in fear. My dad attended residential school. Horrible things happened to him. But in my generation, and the way I was brought up, is that when your family, and whether or not they're close family or whether they're extended family, if they're going through something, if they're going through some kind of trauma, if they are struggling with something, there's a word in the Cree language, kiam. It means let it be. So essentially, you don't ask about it, you don't bring it up unless that person wants to talk about it. So the only thing I knew growing up was that I was surrounded by a darkness, that there was something hovering over my dad and my uncle's heads, and it was bad. It was bad that I felt like we had to run from some unknown, unseen force, that someone was out to get me just because of the color of my skin, just the fact that I was Native. And you're brought up with these perceptions that, oh no, we got to we got to avoid the police. And I had no idea why as a kid. All I knew is that there was a fear there. And because you're not supposed to bring this up, we had to figure this out ourselves. My cousins and I, who are the same age, we talk about it. Like, yeah, my dad's going through the same thing. My mom's going through the same thing. No, they won't tell me what's going on. All I know is white people are bad. And these are the things that you just, you're a kid and you're trying to put puzzle pieces together. And I'm going to tell you a disclaimer right now. As I'm telling you the stories, this is not meant to instill guilt in anybody right now. So I will just put you at ease right now. And everything we're talking about today, this is not a white guilt thing. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that all the trauma and all the issues that I faced in my youth and growing up should be passed on and made to put another demographic or another population down and make them feel bad for something their ancestors did. Because when we talk about reconciliation is something that's done side by side. It's not one-sided. You can't reconcile a problem by just making one party healed and feel better and lift them up, and at the same time the other party, the other group of people, population, is being pushed down, because that creates resentment. And my Musham, in all his wisdom, he knew this. He had an especially bad experience in residential school. But what he taught me was that when you're trying to reclaim your strength, your power, and who you are, you don't destroy somebody else in the process. That's why through all of these stories that I tell you, I prioritize community. I prioritize togetherness. I prioritize collaboration. You'll never hear me put down somebody just because their ancestors may have directly or indirectly been a part of a system or a group of people that contributed to all the trauma that happened in those days. No, you won't. Because just like me, you inherited it too. You know, does that put you in any particular position where you're more or less at fault of anything? No, it just is what it is. We all inherited this. We are here right now at this very moment having conversations about how we can move forward, how we can make things better for the next generation. Because at the end of it all, that's what these stories are meant to be, is just a guideline, an experience that can make the next generation better. I'm finally starting to understand all the things that my mushum told me, that it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about the next generation. That's where we should be in our mind. We've got to stop thinking about, I'm just going to do what makes me feel good right now so I feel better, but not necessarily change or collaborate so that things can be better in the future. Instead, just vent and pass on pain. So you will hear none of that today. Instead, what I will say is that, I mean, how many people I see 66 participants here right now. You know what? I see 66 participants who are human beings, who are people, who are seeking that truth, who are seeking a better world, who are trying to create it, who want to be a part of it. And I will give you all kudos for that. Because at the end of it, you know what, like no individual, not one, not two people, but we have to change society now. We have to change perceptions now. We have to change narratives now. Together, we walk side by side. That's true reconciliation. We all have to heal from the actions of the past as a society, as a room full of people, as cities, as provinces, as a country. We all have to do it together. And that being said, as I was growing up, I'll get back to my story now. We would run back and forth between provinces, between, where I was born, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and to my dad's reserve in Thunderchild. And I was told stories as a kid. And my mushum did his best to pass along his stories and his wisdoms, from the past, things that were passed down to him. And he'd tell me stories of how my ancestors would roam these lands, stories of how proud they were, how brave they were, how strong they were as individuals and as a community, and how special Indigenous people were, how we were connected to this land, how we were connected to each other, how we found that balance just to live in this land and not hurt it, and to just be a part of it and to think of things bigger than ourselves. He made me feel special. It made me feel like I was something. And then I got old enough to go to school. So my first day of school, and to give you some perspective, this was not that long ago. I mean, I'm just pushing 50. So this is late 70s, early 80s. We still had Indian days at school, where the Indian days, all the native kids would go and separated from the white kids. This is not ancient history we're talking about. This is fairly recent. People talk about the good old 80s. Well, the reality is there was still a lot of segregation going on in those days. And I walked into that classroom as a kid, and one of the other kids, older kids, who were supposed to be separated from, came walking up to me, and he grabbed me by the face. And I'm just in kindergarten at this point. And he said, "What are you doing here, Indian?" And up to this point, I had no idea what an Indian was. My mushum never told me what that term meant. They never said, "You are an Indian, you are no." They always just taught me, my mushum taught me, my aunts, uncles, my dad, is that we're a strong people, we're human beings. They never slapped a label on me until I went to school. So then I got a harsh dose of reality at this point. And I was on the offensive. I was on the defensive. Like I just, from day one, I realized that if I wasn't around people who had the same color skin as me, I was not safe. I couldn't trust anybody. And I mean, the stark reality of it is, as I grew older, these perceptions changed once I started to understand people. But at this point in life, when you're that young, all you have to reference is what is going on in front of you. So jump ahead a couple of years again. You know, over those couple of years, you know, my parents would do their best. My mushroom would do his best to try and give me the strength and some advice, some wisdom here and there on how, despite what people would say, this has always been a thing. We are misunderstood, but that doesn't make you less special. And it seemed like the more knowledge that I had gained over the years, the more the incidents would increase, the worse they would get. And I'll give you an example. I was always a pretty good athlete growing up. And particularly the year I'm going to refer to, I was in grade 5. I was in Winnipeg, Manitoba. This was one of those times where we jumped back and forth. You know, I went to school. The teachers had observed me playing baseball and decided, hey, you know what, we got to have this guy come out and, you know, pitch for us because he's pretty good. And they talked me up. They gave me some self-esteem. They, you know, I felt normal. Let's just put it that way. Like I felt like a normal kid that was valued. So then come to city championships, and we wiped the floor with the team. It was borderline unfair, and so it came time at the end of the ball game. You know, like everybody lines up and shakes hands, and the coach of the opposing team, a grown man. I mean, I said I was in grade 5, going into grade 6, so still a kid. He grabs my hand, he pulls me into him really close, and I knew he was mad because we had won. And all he said to me was, "This doesn't matter. All you're ever going to be is an Indian anyway." I let go of my hand and walked away. And because of the way I grew up, all I could do, the only way I knew how to handle this was to just internalize it. Because nobody talked about anything, you know, growing up. I knew that my dad and my mushroom had gone through so many worse things in life, but had the strength to just suck it up. You know, and that's a common saying, you know, for my generation, like whether you're Indigenous or not, like my generation, it was you know, it was kind of like a suck it up buttercup type of approach to things. And so that's how I dealt with it. I internalized it. So as time went on, types of incidents like these compounded. You know, I would internalize it. And because of the coping mechanisms that my people have, a lot of times we would just laugh it off. You know, it is a genuine coping mechanism that Indigenous people have, where they'll take the darkest thing that has happened to them and make a joke about it. You know, just try not to make it as serious, but it weighs on you. It does, because it begins to shape your perception of who you are. And let me tell you, from the inside the mind of an Indigenous person, it actually does start to govern how you behave. because the world won't let you be what you want to be. There's so many terms out there that I've heard over the years, and one of them is, what happened in the past has nothing to do with me. I've heard this term specifically when it comes to, when you talk to a non-Indigenous person about treaty rights, when it comes to any of the reparations that have happened, when it comes to residential schools, 60 scoop, when discussions are being had about all that, there's just an immediate, it's like a defense mechanism. I get that. I get human nature. People want to move on. People sometimes don't want to discuss uncomfortable things. But when you're living the life, when you're living in my skin, that's the reality. You don't have any other choice. You don't have the option to just flip off a light switch for 5 minutes and get in that safe space that everybody talks about. Because let me tell you, as an Indigenous person, I hear the term safe space, or I don't feel safe, thrown around a lot. I wish I knew what that meant. I legitimately do, because to this very day, I don't think I've ever felt safe a day in my life. No, instead, I've had to become resilient, which is what my mushroom taught me, is that no matter what they tried to do to him in residential school, because one of the big things at that time was to take the Indian out of the Indian. That was one of the approaches of residential school. And in my dad's case, the one thing that I learned, the one thing that I was taught, was that they failed. We weren't conquered. We weren't victims. They 100% failed, because I'm here. They are here. A lot of my people are still here. We're surviving. We're resilient. We can take it. So to me, that's where that value came in. That's where that self-worth finally came in after all of that. After going through all that negativity for pretty much my entire life, that's what I realized. That's what it was about, was that resilience, that adaptability, and that I did not have to pass that on. And over and over and over again, I would see that done. People passing on their trauma, people passing on their perceptions, bad attitude. And one of the ways this happens too, we live in our modern times, community and a country where we do promote immigration. And yes, I'm all for people seeking a better life. And let me tell you one problem with the whole process. This is where systemic racism comes in. I've made some pretty good friends over the years coming from other countries. And I will tell you, 4 times I've heard this. People coming through the system, new to this country, who I am still friends with to this day. We talk, we learn from each other, we share stories, we compare how things are in their countries, issues that they have, and I share my stories as well. And I realize that all of us are not so different at our core. We all want the same thing. We all want acceptance. We all want love. We all want understanding. We all want better for our children in the future. And they told me when they entered this country that they were warned. And some stats recently came out about this. But what the immigration people had told them coming into this country was, watch out for those natives. Stay away from them. They're drunks. They're dangerous. A lot of them are into gangs. And how this came about was, as I would have conversations with these people, sit down for coffee, just sharing who you are, the most common comment I would get from people was, wow, you're totally different than what they told me. And I would say, what, who told you? It's like, well, Border Patrol and immigration told us to stay away from you guys because you were dangerous. And I shouldn't be surprised. But at the same time, I don't hold anger, or I don't hold any bad feelings toward them, because I mean, it's just like anything. These are things that are taught. These are things that are passed down because of somebody's fear, somebody's lack of education, somebody's lack of knowledge about somebody else. And that's when I finally started to see, what my mushum would tell me, all those little stories about how if you don't like the world that you're living in right now, create the one you want. And I finally realized that I don't have to be a part of this constant cycle where we're just passing on that negativity and lashing out and trying to make another person feel bad just because of what their particular history is. No, that's like beating your head against a wall. Instead, I choose to pass along the best part of myself and draw that best part of whoever the next person is out of them. And any struggles or issues, worries, concerns that you have, I also try to be a part of that solution as well. I want to hear their side of the story. I want to hear your side of the story. And I hope that person will extend me the same courtesy. And if not, I mean, the timing just wasn't right. I will hold no ill will against them as well. Because we're trying to create communities, we're trying to create connection to people. We're not trying to create connection to a group of people, because what that does is that discounts individual experience. And if you look at the major, the core of all the problems right now when it comes to, it's not only an Indigenous problem. There are cultures all across the world that have one demographic of people who have experienced such loss, such pain, such suffering. And in many instances, they're doing it alone with no way and no hope. And a lot of times it ends up in alcoholism, drug use, suicide. It's like, why? Because we stop paying attention to the individual, and we just, even though it might come from a good place, people get lost in the mix. And that's what I'm all about is, yes, welcoming communities, creating communities, but never, ever forgetting the individual in that community. Because in my culture, we believe in the circle. And in our circle, that circle is made up of individuals beings who none are above the next. We're all part of the circle. And if that circle is broken, it weakens, which stresses the importance of the whole community, but also the individual and how important they are. So that being said, whenever I come across somebody who does not understand and may be a little abrasive, because we're human beings, we all have different personalities. Instead of lashing out, I want to hear their story. Because when it comes to pain, when it comes to people lashing out, that it always comes from a source. It starts somewhere. And I like to learn where that's from, because if I happen to be a part of that unknowingly, whether it's from somebody being victimized, or let's just say an Indigenous person in the past had done something to wrong somebody from another demographic, another ethnicity, I don't want to discount how that affected them, but I want to be a part of the solution. I want to be a part of that healing. So that's why we all need to hear each other. And the importance of opening our ears when we get together. And I'm no exception of this. I try to open my ears. Always try to be, you don't hear with your mouth. And when somebody wants to share something with me, or somebody wants to bounce ideas off of me, I close this and open these. And that's the only way we're going to move forward, right? That's the only way we're ever going to make things better, is if we open our hearts and our minds to each other. Nobody has 100% the answer to all this. I don't claim to. I don't claim to know how we're going to end all of this and how we're going to get to a point where we all just respect each other, live in peace and respect, and that we can be proud. I just want to be a part of it, and I just want to continue to pass the narrative that we are human beings. That at my core, I love you all because we all bleed red. Our hearts beat. We all love. We all have anger. We were given these emotions for a reason, for a purpose. I believe they were all, in the end, made to bring us together. I believe that love and peace and understanding can come out of conflict and fear. So I challenge you all, in my last parting remarks here. There's a lot more I could talk about today, but this is what was in my heart today. This is what I wanted to pass on because, of the state of the world today. And I just want to invite any of you, if you do want to, talk to me, if you have any questions, or you just want to, have a virtual coffee, reach out to me. I think all my contact information is on the website. And, I just want to thank you all for, opening your ear to me. I know it's early. And thank you so much. I'm very humbled and very happy that you would all have me here and hear my story. And I just want to speak for myself that this very process of being able to share my story has been very, very helpful to me in my journey of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, for sharing your deeply personal story about experiences of anti-Indigenous racism, which have resulted directly from settler colonialism, and your continuing belief and resilience in the power of love and compassion and kindness and working together. So there's so much to reflect on listening on your story. And so, Daniel, I would invite you to share some reflections. What are the underlying values which resonate for you and which connect to some of your own stories and work, particularly as it relates to resilience and love and reconciliation?
Yes, thank you. The one thing that struck me with Jesse's story is that it's not the first time I've heard a story like that. And indeed, it's a common experience. I could see myself in those situations. Maybe I wasn't the baseball player, maybe I was on the bus, and another student said, "I wish we'd killed you all out in the past," which happened when I was a kid. So like these experiences are really common. And with the older generation, I'm a little bit younger than Jesse, but not that much younger. He's right that people did not want to talk about it. There was not a engagement with what was actually occurring. And it meant that people were actually putting their trauma on their kids or on their grandkids. And so I think one of the things that really resonated with me with regards to what Jesse was saying was just the need for having those conversations, even though they are tough conversations, but also premising in that on the fact that this isn't about the blame game. It isn't about venting. It isn't about making people feel bad. It's about working together and working towards a new relationship. And in my mind, that's what reconciliation really is about. It's not some end goal. It's not some metric where congratulations, we've done 10 things and we've achieved reconciliation. It's about building a relationship that maybe never existed with Indigenous peoples. And it's going to take different forms. And because it is a relationship, it's going to be something that's going to be a living entity. So it's not just a one and done deal. It's an ongoing process. But, talking about not necessarily wanting to put on blame or put on hate or vent really made me think of my aunt and my own community. That's one of the things she's been telling people for years. So just this fact that it's not about wrong happened and we need to make people feel bad. It's about wrong happened and we need to work together to heal. And she would often talk about how people have wrong done to them all the time. It doesn't make it any less hurtful or meaningful that it occurs, but it's important to recognize that it's not just a simple black and white moral story of this was bad, this is good, and we need to move towards the good away from the bad, because it's a complicated process. And then looking at my own research as somebody in Indigenous studies, one of the things that a lot of Indigenous studies scholars will say with regards to the process of colonialism, which led to where we are, is that it impacted everyone. Indigenous, non-Indigenous, settler, arrivant, it impacted everyone. The land acknowledgement today talked about enslaved people, so there's that impact there. But even just the process itself, it's been a continual process, and it's a process where nobody really came out a winner, although maybe some people came out a little bit wealthier. And I think that's one of the big issues there. And then as somebody who's worked in the field of reconciliation and indigenization for over a decade, yeah, I would totally agree with what Jesse said with regards to people who lash out. In my experience, they are lashing out for a reason. And the worst thing you can do is just shut them down or tell them just you're wrong and not have any further conversation with them. Oftentimes they want to have that conversation, and they're feeling defensive, they're feeling attacked, and they're responding in a way that isn't healthy. But again, just shutting them out or just ignoring them doesn't make the issue actually go away. So, and again, it's important to bear in mind that this doesn't mean that everyone has to be engaged in those conversations every day. So self-care is important as well. But yeah, that's my reflection.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Really appreciate your profound reflections on the story that Jesse was sharing. When I think of, so for everyone who registered for this session, one of the questions that we asked of you is, what would you like to know more about reconciliation? And one of the key themes that really emerged in your responses to that question was, how can we take action? How can we advance reconciliation? And so the question that I have for both of our guests today, Jesse and Daniel, is how can we create spaces or pockets of resistance where radical, meaningful work towards reconciliation can happen? So Jesse or Daniel, who would like to jump into this complex and big question?
Yeah, it is a pretty complex question, and it is a very huge subject. And I'll just tell you from my own personal experience on what would be meaningful to, or what I've seen from my own family, for example. Because I don't want to speak for all Indigenous people, because everybody is at a different point in their journey. Like, everybody's at a different stage in their healing. So I don't want to put like a blanket statement across that will represent everybody, because that's not right. That's not our way either. But what I will say, from what I've seen, in my circles in particular, is that the spaces or pockets that you're referring to have to be consistent and welcoming. And because we live in a society now of trends, let's just put it that way, where something's trending, which means it will go away after a time. Interests will fade. It'll fade off into the background once something more interesting comes along. And we have to stop that. We have to start making things just a part of who we are as a community, not just Indigenous people, but all of society as well, is that we have to make these things this is just the way it is. We're just trying to create a community where we recognize and acknowledge all of these things that happened in the past made what we have today. So this just has to exist. It's just there. It's just a way of life that we're trying to continually and consistently trying to heal and create these spaces. So, not just, we have a 3 or 6 month project that's going to focus on reconciliation. Can you put those timeframes on human nature and healing? You can't, right? I mean, so, I understand funding, I understand all of that, but what I will say, as individuals, as everybody that's here right now, it's simple. I mean, you don't have to open your wallet in a lot of cases. You have to open your heart and your mind. Ask these questions. How can I be a part of it? It's little things. Hey, do you need to talk to me about this? Hey, let's go for a coffee. Tell me about what's on your mind. It's creating relationship. It's being part of this solution right here. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a big truck hitting you on the side of the head solution. It's the simple things like this. So that, for me anyway, that's where I would see, how everybody, your average everyday person, could be a part of it.
Thank you, Jesse, for those reflections. Daniel, would you like to share any reflections about this question up on the slide? Or we have a really interesting question from one of the participants, Janet Dawson.
I can just quickly respond. I think it might also respond partly to Janet's question, although I think we can have further conversations regarding that. Again, I support and agree with what Jesse's saying there wholeheartedly. I do like the idea of having multiple pockets, multiple spaces, and providing opportunities for people to engage with the material at their comfort level or at their level of knowledge. And I say this partly as somebody who is currently putting on a workshop series at the University of Northern British Columbia, has put on a workshop series last year, and then did it prior to that at the University of Alberta, looking at providing basic information about Indigenous peoples. Basically, Indigenous Studies 101 is what I call it. And part of that is recognizing that a lot of university professors have been asked or been tasked with indigenizing course content, but because of the way our education system has been established, they've made it all the way to their doctorate sometimes without having any Indigenous content at all. So they know nothing, but they're literally being paid because they're experts in their field. And so creating a open space, I don't want to say a safe space, but an open space where they can come and learn about various topics. And I'm not going to necessarily provide any sort of judgment if they're there, because I don't know what level they're at, but just providing that opportunity for them to come and learn the basics, I think, is key. And it's a great way of actually starting. But then there's other activities that occur as well, dealing with topics in a more advanced state, research talks coming in, things like that. So I really like this idea of having multiple spaces that are available. And when I was at the University of Alberta, the workshop series that we had running, we actually started building partnerships with the School of Medicine, with the School of Nursing, and then also providing a certificate so that people in professional programs, people who were working in certain industries, could get a document saying, I participated in this workshop series, so they could say to their employer, I'm at least trying. And I think that's the key thing, is you have to provide that opportunity for people to try. Ultimately, you're not going to know if it's going to be successful, but part of this is just providing those opportunities and trusting in people's good intentions.
Thank you so much, both Jesse and Daniel. And really picking up on some of the key themes that you've shared, also really speak to some of the content in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the 94 calls to action, because they talk about, really working across sectors, health, justice, Canadian legal systems, the type of oath that people take when they first arrive in this country. So it's really profound changes that are being called for through the TRC calls to action, and particularly as it relates to funding, ongoing sustained funding for this kind of work to happen in a deep and a meaningful way. So we have a question from Janet that I will read out to everyone, because I think this is a really excellent question that you're raising, Janet. So for organizations that want to make reconciliation part of their approach for staff development, what are your suggested steps to move this forward, recognizing that everyone starts their reconciliation journey from many different places, which is exactly what both Jesse and Daniel were talking about, that you start from wherever you're at, recognizing many of us are beginners and some are much more advanced in this space. So Jesse, would you like to share any reflections in response to Janet's question?
Yes, for sure. I'm actually asked this quite a bit where I'm from right now. And the main thing that I like to tell people when it comes to this, specifically when organizations want to change their culture, when it comes to reconciliation. And what I say to them, and it's a pretty simple concept, really. And whenever any organization is wanting to put something into effect or some kind of change like this and be a part of reconciliation, just remember to work with Indigenous people. Because 100% of the things that have been put in place for Indigenous people to date has hurt or damaged us in some way. And whether it's intentional or unintentional, whether it's policy, whether it's procedure, any of that, make sure Indigenous people voices are a part of this with you. That's what you have to remember. Because in the end, it's going to be, that's what it's going to be all about, right? Is every organization's relationship with their Indigenous staff or the Indigenous services and communities around them, their perception of that particular organization, that's where it's all going to come into play, right? Because now you are actually starting the narrative to any Indigenous people and organizations that we are open to the way you think. We are open to your thoughts. Whether they are part of the pain or whether they are, come from a good place where you want to build a relationship. So that's I know it's not a direct, A plus B equals C, like, yes, do this exact thing, but you got to remember in Indigenous culture, that's the way it was. It was more of a concept that you passed along, a lesson, and you take that concept, put your heart into it, and that's what will be reflected. That's what will be seen.
Thank you, Jesse. Daniel, any reflections on that question from Janet that you'd like to share?
No, I would agree. It's important to make sure that what's being done is with Indigenous people. That is key. And it needs to be an ongoing relationship. This is important as well. So I have a friend who's a Nook who has this wonderful story about being invited to talk about Inuit culture in a classroom. And the people who were organizing the event wanted to record it so that they could use it year in, year out without actually having her come back at any point in time. And she had to explain to them why that was inappropriate. So, and it could be possibly also pushing back against the culture of the school based on how they record things. But part of that is, again, working with Indigenous people. Making sure that your relationship with them is meaningful, it's fruitful, it's beneficial to both parties, and that it's not just extractive. And I think that's one of the key components when it comes to working with Indigenous people.
Thank you. And just a follow-up sort of question and reflection is that when you, Jesse and Daniel, when you're speaking about really working with Indigenous peoples, how does this relate to the importance of hiring Indigenous people into leadership positions with real decision-making authority and power to influence what happens in our society? Any thoughts or reflections on that?
Yes, for sure. Well, first of all, I have to, again, I mean, this is a thing in my culture. I have to put forth the disclaimer that I don't speak for all Indigenous people. When we answer questions like this, it's always, this is what I was taught and this is why, and it's a reflective of the culture around me, the people that I grew up with. So I will put that out there first. And what I was taught was that it's important, specifically now when we're going through all these changes with the TRC calls to action, that those people that I grew up with, whether it was directly from my own First Nation or the surrounding ones, is that there's still a huge chunk of people that aren't at a place in their life where they haven't even crawled out of the pit yet, so to speak. They're still neck deep in the trauma and the after effects of the residential school system, the 60s school, all of that. And they haven't even gotten to a point yet where they have the self-confidence or have been taught the way to climb out of that and function in today's society, much less hold down a career, right? Because they just haven't been taught those skills. So it's important for organizations to, have these individual people, Indigenous people that can hold that status, that are at a place in their journey where they can be that leader, where they can be that beacon to other Indigenous people that, hey, this person has gone through the same pain, that maybe I can too. How do I do that? You're creating it's like a lighthouse, you know, on a foggy day when you're out in the sea, you're lost, you don't know how to get back to a shore, you know, having that indigenous lighthouse, so to speak, there to guide that person back to shore. Hey, you know, maybe I can get there, and, you know, maybe I can, you know, have a good future. Maybe I can have more than I thought I could. Maybe I can succeed. Maybe I don't just have to succumb to what people expect me to be. Maybe I can stop drowning. You know, that's why it's not the authority piece of it. It's not just having the authority, but just being able to have the voice and be a beacon to others and be a role model. Because, you know, like at the core of, you know, our particular culture, that's what it was about. It was just trying to be there for others, you know, just having that opportunity to help somebody else for the next generation. So
thanks for those beautiful reflections, Jesse. Daniel, any final comments overall before we start to wrap up?
I think just getting into mind the fact that part of the colonial project was also propping up people to be Indigenous leaders, but using them with regards to what the colonizer wanted to occur. And I'm not saying that happened with everyone, but there are notable instances where that occurred. And so I think one of the key questions organizations need to ask themselves is, if they are bringing on Indigenous leadership, is it a genuine inclusion, or are they doing this for purely selfish reasons? Is there actual power behind it? And then also recognizing that for a lot of Indigenous communities, when people recognize that the person is there as a figurehead but not as an actual leader, that actually ruins relationships, moves things backwards, and people won't necessarily bring that up with the organization. So they may talk within community, there may be conversations that occur, it may eventually reach the organization at some point, but it doesn't necessarily reach the organization. So that's key as well. It's just making sure that it is actually, we want somebody who's a leader, we want somebody who actually has some measure of power or authority, some ability to actually make decisions on matters. And if that's not actually occurring, it can make things worse. So it is really this question of making sure organizations are actually doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Daniel. Those were really important reflections that you were sharing. And I'd like to just give a huge thank you to both Jesse and Daniel for all your wonderful stories and reflections that you've shared during today's session, and some really powerful thoughts. And that's leaving me with the sense that this is about being authentic in building authentic, trusting, meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples and working with Indigenous peoples. So on the slide, I just want to briefly thank the Joint Planning Group who helped us to really co-create this fourth COVID-19 Conversation Series. So you'll see Jesse's name there as well. And I also want to thank Tia and Miriam, friends and former NCCDHs who co-created this series with the Joint Planning Group from the ground up. And then on the next slide, as part of our ongoing series for the fourth COVID-19 conversation process, in 2 weeks from today, we have another set of storytellers who have been kind enough to agree to share with us ways that they were overcoming organizational challenges to advance equity during the pandemic. You can register on the NCCDH website. And then as a last point, I really encourage you to complete the evaluation. Pema's going to drop the link to the evaluation in the chat. And the evaluation link will also pop up when you leave the webinar session. So thank you to everyone. Really appreciate everyone being here. And again, a huge thank you to both Jesse and Daniel. And thanks, and have a great rest of the day.